The book that I'm going to be discussing with you today is A First Rate Madness, Uncovering the Link Between Leadership and Mental Illness by Nasir Gahimi. He argues that the relationship between mental illness and leadership boils down to these two major things: that depression, bipolar disorder, and manic traits may lead to specific attributes that make us better crisis leaders. Creativity, empathy, realism, and resilience are these attributes. He structures the book around the qualities developed, specifically creativity, realism, empathy, resilience, as stated. He first goes over General Sherman and Ted Turner. He theorizes that they had bipolar disorder and had high highs and low lows. And in those states of high highs, they were very creative. He then goes into realism by looking at Churchill and Lincoln, and that their depression or states of depression led to them being more realistic leaders. He then goes into empathy, focusing on Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And their episodes of depression or general depression, making them more empathetic leaders. And he ends this area of the book by going into resilience, specifically JFK and Franklin Roosevelt, that their manic traits, their really high highs, coupled with their adversity in life, led to great resilience. And then there are three other sections. There's treatment, which is kind of a small section of the book, mental health, and not strictly focused on mental illness, and the stigma of mental illness in politics. I'm going to be specifically focusing on the majority of the book, which is those leaders I discussed. So something I found interesting, because I'm not a huge history buff, is just like general facts about these leaders, although it is through the lens of mental illness. He argued that Turner's manic traits, or he theorized / argued, allowed him to think of creative solutions. So he was able to launch CNN with funding for only 1 year. So they literally only had enough funding for 1 year of CNN being in service, if you will. And correctly theorized, if CNN launched with enough bang, people would take notice and outside funding streams would occur, which they did. Then, when ABC wanted to launch a direct competitor, Turner successfully launched CNN2 to stop ABC from competing and eventually bought them out, which created a decade of no competition. Those two were hugely creative solutions that no one else had thought of, and Gahimi argues it's because of Turner's high highs, his manic traits, that he was able to do this. He then goes into Churchill's depressive episodes, in that it made him easier to accurately and realistically assess the threat Germany posed during World War II. Most people were looking at it through rose-colored glasses, but he argues that Churchill's depression gave him a clear lens to view the world through. He ultimately tried to warn political leaders as early as 1930 about Hitler, whereas Chamberlain wanted to try and rationally convince Hitler of the need to avoid war, which I think we all know how that worked out. Interesting fact number 2, Gandhi's depression ultimately deepened his empathy, allowing him to understand the mental state and feeling of his adversaries, which in turn allowed him to communicate the suffering of his people in a manner they would understand. So he was able to accurately and concisely communicate the feelings of his people through the people that did not agree with him, because he deeply understood his adversaries and his people. And then he goes into Roosevelt, his manic traits, coupled with his struggle, in his case polio, forged a great resilience, which saw us through World War II and a Great Depression. I mean, there were lots of downsides, but I'm not going to really get into this right now. And there was like a clear correlation to the book, which I thought was really great. Here are just a few parallels. I didn't get into many because I don't have much time. So creativity aligned clearly with creative thinking and innovation. Empathy aligned with understanding others and empathetic listening. Realism aligned with developing a clear direction. You have to see your company's I guess, mission, goals, how they can achieve it very clearly in order to successfully do that. And resilience, sustaining commitment and cohesion, specifically with goals. I thought you have to have a sustained pace to achieve those goals. So you have to have resilience. Just to go back to that, I think it's really cool that all of these traits are mentioned in the book and they aligned so nicely, because those traits, even though they were results for these people or heightened, I guess, characteristics for these people because of their mental illness, they're characteristics that all of us try and achieve at some point in our lives for the most part. So there were some positives of the book. There were a lot of positives. It dedicates a whole section to the treatment of mental illness. I think that's really important. Part of the book, I guess I'll mention this now, part of my issue with the book is that it seems to glorify untreated mental illness, but the fact that the treatment aspect is there is really great. I wish it had been at the front of the book and not the back of the book. It thoroughly provides evidence to support mental illness diagnosis to some degree. I don't know that it is appropriate to look back and apply a mental illness diagnosis on people when you only have papers and you can't really talk to them. It discusses the positives and negatives of having a mental illness. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily positive to have a mental illness, but the book does, I guess positive is not a good way to say it, destigmatize it. It takes a nuanced approach to mental health and mental illness specifically. It doesn't make one feel bad for having a mental illness. I think it sees that mental illness is a gray area. And some people, it's not black and white, I guess. Starting point, this is a great starting point for destigmatizing mental health, mental illness in leadership. I think it's a starting point. I don't think it's a finish. I think we should build upon this book to help destigmatize it, specifically in leadership, in the workplace, talking about it, making it a very normal thing. And I think organizing his book around these character traits were highly effective, because the whole book does discuss mental illness, but again, like if you're looking for leadership qualities, you can go into these books and you can hear about phenomenal leaders who completely exemplify these qualities. Here are the things that I think it should have done better. It almost glorified or encouraged untreated mental health. I mean, the whole book was about how most of these men did not treat their mental illness. I worry that people who have a mental illness and are taking medications are going to go and read this book and then think that they don't need to take their medication. There were no female leaders in the book. I mean, there haven't really been female leaders, so I understand why to some degree, but I wish there had been female leaders. It heavily focused on depression and bipolar disorder. It mentioned manic traits. Again, like that's often coupled with bipolar disorder, those whole high highs. And even like the low lows are often coupled with bipolar disorders. So he really only focused on two major disorders, and I get it, like the book's not that big, but there are significantly more mental illnesses than that. It was very formulaic, the writing. I knew what I was going to get every chapter. It made it very boring. The sources weren't always reliable. Sometimes they were just like talking to somebody in passing, it seemed. They weren't always necessarily the most reliable sources. The treatment section of the book was very small, and again, I wish it had been at the beginning and not the end, to put emphasis on the fact that mental illness is not something you have to live with, and it can be treated. And I don't know how much I'm buying what he's pushing. I don't know, like, if it's a chicken and an egg scenario or an egg and a chicken scenario with these traits. And I can't really wholeheartedly buy in to the book because of the fact that it seems to almost glorify untreated mental illness. For me in the future, it's going to make me more accepting of those who struggle with mental health disorders. I think that we all have some kind of biases in us to some degree because of the way that society has set us up. And I think leadership is one of those ways, and politics. it's going to deepen my understanding of the world around me, making me a more dynamic leader. The more we understand about the world around us, the more dynamic we become. I think this does that for me. And then it's going to encourage a healthy work-life balance. It's going to encourage folks to take a mental health day when needed. I would like to do that. I would like to normalize that. I would like my employees to say, I need a mental health day and take it off. And I would like to do that myself. I want to get brave enough to be able to say that. There is no reason why I should feel bad for saying that. This is my last slide. I think is an important takeaway quote. We are left with a dilemma. Mental health sanity does not ensure good leadership. In fact, it often entails the reverse. Mental illness can produce great leaders, but if the illness is too severe or treated with the wrong drugs, it produces failure or sometimes evil. The relationship between mental illness and leadership turns out to be quite complex, but it certainly isn't consistent with the common assumption that sanity is good and insanity is bad. And here are my references. Thank you.